I'm really happy to be back with another episode of The Laundry, and today's guest is Viveka Strangert. Welcome so much to The Laundry.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, you are a prolific person in the Nordic compliance community, and I know that the media sometimes refer to you as a whistleblower in the Swedbank case, and I know you don't really think of yourself as one. So, can you, in your own words, tell what happened to the audience? Because we have a lot of listeners in Norway and Denmark who might not be that familiar with the case and your involvement in it.
Sure. I was the Chief Compliance Officer of Swedbank at 2016. And at that time, we had just got a new CEO. And the first time I reported the quarterly report for the board and for the CEO, we had done an audit of the Baltic business in the AML area, and we found quite severe deficiencies. So it was just like another day at the job, and I presented that report. As always, compliance has some findings that we report on, and we expect the business to close the findings and the gaps. And that's sort of the purpose of being a compliance officer. But maybe I don't really know what happened with the report, because quite shortly afterwards I left the company because I and the CEO were not. Well, we didn't agree on what to do with things and how things should be reported. So I felt at that time that to be a compliance officer, you need to have that very strong support from your boss, which is your CEO. And I really didn't feel that I had it. So I felt that I had to leave. I didn't feel that support, and then I didn't need to leave myself because the CEO told me to leave. So we we were not didn't cooperate that well as I had been doing with the previous CEO. So I wasn't really a whistleblower. I was just doing my job as a compliance officer and reporting deficiencies that we had identified. And then later on, there was this TV program in Sweden, and that was about 3 years later. Uh, it showed that we were quite right in the compliance department. There were severe deficiencies, and you didn't have the KYC, which resulted in that there probably were quite a lot of fishy business and customers in the portfolio.
And that's when the case blew up and the investigation started, and which has now resulted in this big case in court.
Yeah, it's not really the AML issues that is in the court. It's more about the CEO going out to the market in the end of 2018, saying that there was no criminal activities in the portfolio, and that they in Swedbank had looked through everything and they had found nothing. So that's what the court is actually about. Did she know what she was saying when she said that? In that case, it would have been perhaps market abuse. So that's what the case is about.
And as part of this case, you have been to court and testified. And I know you can't go into details about like the case; it's still ongoing. But on a personal level, what has it been like to testify in court in such a big case?
It's been really bizarre, as when I started to read again about Swedbank, when the TV show came, and they had put all the puzzle together, showing all the customers that were in the portfolio, which I wasn't aware of. I just had reported that we didn't have the KYC in place. That was like taking some parts of a TV show or a film or something. It was very absurd. And then ending up being one of the main characters in this film, that was the feeling of being in the court. But I must say that my part in the court, I was there a couple of weeks ago, it was more about telling the court and the prosecutor about what does a compliance officer do? What is KYC? Why is it important to have KYC? So I wasn't that interesting, think, for the court out of more for the prosecutor. It was more about the facts and the details of how you work as a compliance officer. So I didn't have that, you know, juicy details. I think that came with other witnesses than me.
But and then just as you mentioned, being dragged into this as sort of a main character and being mentioned in the media and being, you know, talked about as a whistleblower, which you don't necessarily identify, that must also have been kind of strange.
Very weird. Everything is and then you follow this in media, at least in the Swedish media, and all of these people that you've worked with. It's very strange feeling.
The Swedbank case is just one of several high-profile cases that linked to AML and financial crime. You have the Danske Bank case as well. So, in your opinion, how has these very, very profile cases changed the culture of compliance in the Nordics? Have they made an important impact on how we work to prevent money laundering and being more compliant, in your opinion?
I think when this exploded in media, first the Danske Bank and then the Swedbank case, it has been apparent for everyone, also ordinary people, that this isn't just about compliance and collecting the KYC and having the routines and processes in place. It's about real dirty money and money flowing out of Russia and other parts. It makes it really on a global level and the geopolitical level things that matters. If money hadn't been flowing out of Russia through the Baltics, and I'm not saying that it did through Swedbank because, but we know it did through Danske Bank and some other Nordic banks. If that wouldn't have been the case, Putin wouldn't have the opportunity of paying his friends around him, and maybe it wouldn't be so sure for him to sit there and invade Ukraine and having all these people supporting him because he's actually bought that support, and that was through these Nordic banks, among other places, of course. But that's how they could buy their properties in London. They could have their fancy schools for their children, etc. So it's really lifting it all up to another level. And I think we all have been much more aware of this. To be honest, 2016, when I had this compliance report to the board of Swedbank, I was also naive. I looked upon it as a compliance issue, but it's not just a compliance issue. It's for real.
Mm. I actually got a little chill down my spine hearing you talk about it because you're right. It's not just a compliance exercise, but linked to actual people and real life events that are important on a global level. You've been in the game for a while. Do you think now that banks and financial institutions have more the right tools to efficiently combat this problem with money laundering?
Yes, absolutely. It's, I mean, the banks have been investing millions and billions of maybe not always the right things, but it's been so many investments in resources, in IT tools, in training for their staff. So of course everyone is much more aware and have higher fences. And what might be scary on the other end is when all the big banks and the really serious actors on the market are shaping up in this area. And, I mean, the criminals, they're just looking for other ways of money laundering or laundering their money. So they're going to smaller banks or to less serious uh, firms on the market. So they will find their way. But it's pushing out and making it more polarized to the shady side of the financial industry. That's also dangerous. So I think the regulators and the supervisory authorities, I know they are aware of this problem, but the de-risking problem is also uh, very something you need to be very aware of, that is happening.
Let's dig deeper into the topic of culture of compliance. You mentioned in the beginning that you had actually made up your mind to leave Swedbank before you were let go. What were the signals that made it so certain that it was the right choice? You mentioned the collaboration with top management, but was there anything else that stood out as like, okay, I need to leave. This is not a good place to work for me right now.
No, it was actually that problem because uh, to work within the compliance department, it's not you're very exposed for criticism, and you're not always coming with the good messages to the business. So in a business, you need to have that really strong support within the culture and also from the top management. This um, tone from the top is so extremely important. So if you don't have that, you can't do a good job. And I think that's important. And this tone at the top is so extremely important. And I didn't get that from the CEO at that time. And to be honest, I don't really know what the board was like. I had the feeling before it was the same board that they supported me, but when I left the bank, no one from the board called me actually and asked what had happened. So that's rather strange.
Yeah, uh, I agree. And there's a lot of
But
young.
I can also add that no one from the Finansinspektionen, the Swedish FSA, called me either, which is also strange.
Mm,
If you look at in the hindsight, it's strange.
you're still involved in compliance, and you sit on several boards. How do you have any reflections or thoughts on how things have changed since 2016 to now? Do you think the regulators and the board would have, the regulators would have called you today if the same thing happened?
To start with, actually, the regulation has changed. Previously, it was only when the CRO left the bank that had been lifted to the board and approved by the board and also the regulator. Now it's also the chief compliance officer is included in that routine. It's EBA regulations, so that
Mm,
would have happened. But I also think that not just because of my case, but about all the things that had happened, you really need to take care of your control functions because as a board member, those are actually your sort of insurance that things are working out well. So you need to have that very close connection between the board and the control functions. And I think also the control functions have been lifted a bit. I don't know if it's good or bad, but previously the second line of defense always reported to the CEO and things went through the CEO. Now it's very clear that they go directly to the board as well.
mm. Um, So you sit on several boards now, and how do you make sure that the companies where you are a board member now creates a culture where people dare to speak up if they see something is not right, that the second line report to you guys what, the real findings, good and bad?
Well, I actually always have one-on-ones with all of the heads of the control functions to create that sort of non-structural discussions before every board meeting or committee meeting where they can lift concerns or successes that they've seen, and we have that dialogue. I try to create a forum where they can feel that they can always give me a phone call. But at the same time, it's of course important not to interfere too much in what is the domain of the CEO. That is, you have to have the segregation of duties also on a board and CEO level. But for my own comfort, I want to talk to the head of compliance on a regular basis. That feels important. And for me, I also scrutinize the boards that I'm sitting in. I wouldn't sit in any board that I was offered. I always check the owners and the culture of that company.
Mm. You mentioned also when we talked about, back in 2016 that you were also a bit naive, thought of it as like a compliance exercise and etc. Now, 6 years later, what are some of the other sort of reflections you've made and things you've seen have changed over the that period of time?
It is a lot about this naive thing that things happen also in Swedish banks or in Nordic banks. I don't think we were aware of that. And also, which has been exposed recently about the insiders in the companies. So if you are at the bank and you have a big credit loss, to always look into if there are any insiders involved in that, then it can also be a money laundering case or a fraud case. It's not always a credit loss only. And I think that is something that we are understanding more and more. So I, it's not always. I'm I'm getting more and more suspicious in things and seeing criminals, and that's perhaps not such a nice way of looking upon business, but it's sort of spilled over a bit. That
There's a lot of young people starting in compliance. It's a growing profession, which, you know, it has exploded over the last couple of years. What advice would you give to young professionals starting out in this field? And yeah.
um, to have integrity and to see that when things get tough, really ask yourself, do you want to take part of this business? Will you be able to look yourself in the mirror in a couple of years? Because otherwise, well, you should try to give it a push, but you will not be able to, as a young compliance officer, change a culture in a company. So if it's really the wrong culture, then you should look out for some other way to work. I think that's something that you need to bring with you, because things tend to pop up even though it takes a couple of years afterwards. It does pop up, and then you don't want to be one of the ones working and covering up things.
Mm, good advice. Um, you mentioned that regulation has changed, so now the regulators also contact if the chief compliance officer leaves, etc. Are there any other regulation changes that you think are for the good, and also if there's anything that's for the worse?
Sometimes I think in the AML area there is an over regulation on a detailed level that we get from the EU, and that hits us in Sweden directly. I think if you have too many details, there is a risk that you miss these cultural issues and you miss your sort of gut feeling. So that sort of management overlay is missed because you have to do things in a tick in the box compliance manner. And you don't have that many. I mean, the resources are limited. So if you have a lot of things you have to do on a detailed level, it it sort of ends up in the tick in the box compliance, and you stop thinking yourself. And I think that is a risk with some of the regulation that we see now. That is, I mean, every time there's a new AML directive or the guidelines we get from EBA, uh, they're longer and longer and more details. uh, Sometimes it's hard to tailor them for the business you're driving. So I think that's a risk.
And I see we are starting to run out of time, so I'll wrap up with two questions. First, Um, are there any resources, books, podcasts, YouTube videos, accounts on LinkedIn, email list, etc., that you would recommend people to follow to in order to stay updated on compliance AML?
That's a good question. I subscribe of the Swedish police have quite a lot of good information in this area, and they also have webinars. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not so great, but it's still good to keep up. Uh, Before COVID, they had these physical meetings and only 100 people could come. But now, as they're webinars, I think they're really good. And I am quite sure they're talking about trends and what they identify. And I'm sure that they're open for also listeners in other countries. Samordningsfunktionen is the name of it. So that's a good source, I think.
That's a good tip. And finally, what is the best thing about working in compliance?
This is going to sound really cheesy, but it's making the world a little bit better. And I do a lot of training, and sometimes training to groups that haven't been working with this as much as they should have, and to see them understand their part of this big puzzle, and the geopolitical areas, and also the criminality and the shootings that we've had in Sweden, and their little part in this link, it makes difference. I think that's really the best part.
I think that was a really, really good answer. Thank you so much for coming on the laundry, Viveka. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.